Perfect.
Yeah. And I'll give the floor to you. I'll basically say that I'm giving the floor to Lisa right now, and then it will be your time to
Okay,
go.
that sounds great.
I'm going to mute myself and I will let people in. Then
Perfect.
I'm going to share my screen.
Okay. And then
Okay.
start recording.
Yeah.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for like a minute to have a bit more people.
Yeah. Hi. Hello. This is Ali Kapucu.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, I think we can start. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome. My name is Gökçe Okulu, and I serve as the Climate Adaptation Program Director at Development Workshop, and I will be your host today. But let me see if we're recording. Okay, recording is started. Perfect. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have you all with us for the second session of the Contributors to Development online webinar series. So let me get the least exciting part out of the way first. Just a few housekeeping notes. Please keep your microphones muted during the session, and our assistant Meryem Sarıkaya is here with us, and she may mute participants if needed to ensure a smooth flow. And we will also share the registration form in the chat. If you haven't registered yet, we kindly ask you to do so for follow-up communications and also upcoming webinars. After Lisa's presentation, I'll start with a few questions, and then we will open the floor to yours, and we will be together for about 75 minutes. And please use the raise hand function, and I'll give the floor to you one by one. The webinars and discussions will be conducted in English, so we would appreciate if you could ask your questions in English too, and thank you for your understanding. So before I hand over to our guest Lisa, let me briefly walk you through how this journey began. The Contributors to Development, or Kalkınmaya Katkı Verenler, was launched by Development Workshop back in 2012 with a very clear intention: to gather and share the life experiences, insights, and long-term knowledge of people who have dedicated themselves to development, and to pass this on to younger generations. Over time, the program has brought together people working across areas like rural development, social policy, and community-based initiatives. On the screen, you see the books published within the program over the time, and then these are all accessible and available in our website too. And through life stories, field visits, workshops, and direct exchanges, this program has created a space where experiences are not just recorded, but also discussed, challenged, and even rethought. At its heart, KKV, Contributors to Development, has always been about learning across generations and about encouraging young people to take an active role in shaping development processes. In November last year, we visited more than 20 institutions in the United States, And the purpose of that visit was to build new partnerships, exchange perspectives, and explore how development and civil society work are evolving in different contexts. And throughout these meetings, we engage with a wide range of experts, of course. And then what became clear was that the ideas and the discussions we were part of there should not stay limited to those meetings. They needed to travel, to be shared, and to connect with the audiences here in Turkey. And with the support of the Embassy of Switzerland in Ankara, we were able to turn this intention into a more structured and accessible format. And this is how the Contributors to Development online webinar series came to life. In our first webinar last month, we started this conversation by reflecting on the role of civil society in policy processes. From Andrew's presentation and the discussions we went through, what stayed with us from that discussion was quite clear, actually. Meaningful change does not emerge only from formal structures, but also from relationships, persistence, and the ability to connect knowledge with practice. Today, with Lisa, we're taking that conversation one step further. Because if participation and engagement are one side of the story, the other side is how people actually express themselves, organize, and respond, sometimes even unexpected, creative, and informal ways. With the second session, we're opening a space to think about how culture, media, and everyday forms of expression intersect with civic participation. This series, as its core, is about making these connections visible between global discussions and local realities, between ideas and action, and between different ways of knowing and engaging. And we're very happy to continue this journey with you and to have Lisa with us today to guide us through the conversation. But enough with me talking, and let me introduce Lisa to you before I give the mic to her. So one second. Lisa Hinz is assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, which she's moving correctly, but she can give you more information. Focusing identity politics in Turkey and its neighborhood, she studies issues including foreign policy, authoritarianism and creative resistance, and Kurdish politics. Recent projects examine media platforms as sites of politics. Topics include gender edutainment, which is education plus entertainment, in cooking shows, curations of history in government YouTube videos, and the role of media content in international conflicts. Today, our topic is politics of pop culture, creative resistance, and civic participation. So, over to you, Lisa. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Gökçe. Thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you to everyone for putting this together. It's a real honor to be able to speak with this group. I think this is such a fantastic initiative. And particularly, I think the impetus to try to get more youth involved in development initiatives, to get them more engaged in politics and civic participation is a really noble one and a tough one, given all of the demands on our time and attention that in a lot of ways media is posing. And so what I want to do today is kind of think about the ways in which we might see youth in particular, as well as traditionally unengaged or sometimes politically apathetic individuals, how they might get excited about politics or how they might even participate in politics without knowing it. One of the things that I study a lot in my work is the way in which everyday media, things like even cooking shows, can have politics built into, can have sort of themes about what the ideal woman in Turkey looks like and how she should behave, and all of these norms of behavior can be contributed through media. But what we want to think about also is how individuals who are not part of these big media structures or are not part of government can use art and popular culture and creative resistance as a way of getting involved in politics, of thinking about politics, of expressing political views in ways that we might not be familiar with or we might not normally think about. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about sort of non-traditional forms of civic participation. So I will go ahead and share my screen so that I can get some images up for you, because I think that images are some of the best ways to tell our stories, particularly because I study media. So You may be familiar with these images, and if you're not, I'm happy to explain just a little bit about them and to take some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start by talking about a show that you may be familiar with, Çevrimiçi, which is translated as sort of cranberry sorbet. Of course, it's not a sorbet, it's more of a drink. But the idea is that there is this very popular television show that is now in its fourth season, that sort of brings together pious and secular families and, you know, all of the clashes that ensue when you have individuals, or that can ensue when you have individuals from different lifestyles, sometimes scheming against each other, sometimes falling in love. But this particular show became a hot topic of conversation, even amongst academics, even amongst sociologists and media studies individuals, in the run-up to the elections in 2023, the parliamentary and presidential elections in Turkey in 2023. And what I found was that individuals were talking about politics through their discussions of characters like Nursema, who is the woman that you see, the headscarf woman in the image there. And they were saying, well, if the opposition wins, then Nursema is going to become a graphic artist. She might move to New York. She'll marry the person that she loves. And if the opposition doesn't win, then she's going to have to stay married to an individual that she doesn't want to be married to. She's not going to be working outside the home, even though she's this very talented artist. So people were sort of speculating about the future of this character while they were talking about elections. And I found this very, very fascinating. It was also the case that individuals who were watching the show and talking about the show were sort of using this character as an image of feminist resistance, of a headscarfed woman, of a pious woman who is wanting to work outside the home, wanting to make choices for herself that her family is not allowing her to do so. And so you had the magazine Kafa put Nursema on the cover with, of course, the very poignant or important label of 6284, which is the law on the protection of family and prevention of violence against women. So there's a politicization of this character that is happening by members of society, by individuals who are watching the show and commenting on it. And of course, this became even more so when there was a ban, a broadcasting ban that was put on the show, which you see on the right-hand side. This is members of the show's creative team using Twitter or X to push back and say, don't touch our television show. You're probably familiar with the background of it, but this was a show that was ostensibly banned for scenes of violence against women. But a lot of people said, actually, this was because some of the characters in the show who are committing violence against women are representative of members of government or look like some of the families that are affiliated with government. So there was just a lot of political tension and controversy around this show. And that, of course, made people participate even more, right? So just to give us in our mind a little bit of sense of how people can start talking about a television show in ways that have to do with politics. What I wanted to do first, before we kind of get into the examples that I want to give and thinking about how tweeting about a television show can actually be a political act, and why individuals might use popular culture references in talking about politics, is to really understand the way in which Turkey and in other countries, media is often a very tilted political battleground. So if we think about popular culture or media in general as sort of a site of political resistance, potentially, or of political participation, it's important to understand that that battleground is tilted towards the government, right? And so it's tilted such that it doesn't necessarily include a lot of opposition voices. And this has been the case in Turkey and a lot of other places as well, as processes of what we call media capture happen. That is, as the government kind of takes over media stations and controls the news that is spread, but also the entertainment types that are spread. So just as a very quick background, and I'm sure you're familiar with all of this, but it's important to kind of unpack the battleground that we're talking about if we're looking at processes of creative resistance. So when we think about media capture, we often think about television stations, right? And we think about state television. And of course, that's the case in Turkey. You have TRT, Turkish radio and television, and you have lots of those channels, right, that are broadcasting in different languages, that are sending news and entertainment to the diaspora, that are trying to cultivate audiences abroad, potentially for to engage in tourism or economic exports, to really spread Turkey's image abroad. So that's something that the state controls. And then you also have not just the channels of content dissemination, but also the media watchdog that sort of polices what kind of content is appropriate. And we know that within the structure of RTÜK, the Supreme Board of Radio and Television, that's tilted in a way that the governing party that has the most seats in parliament has more members on that board. So this board is also tilted in favor of the government in terms of what is being policed and what is being fined and what is having a broadcast ban applied to it. So that's a tilt, right, in terms of media content, both news media and entertainment media. And here you just have an example of one of the ways in which RTÜK had been exercising its power. And what we've seen in the past couple of years is a crackdown on LGBTI plus content or queer content. And so platforms like Disney Plus, like Netflix, and some of these others have received fines from RTÜK because of the content that they're sharing. So again, it's not just about news media, it's about entertainment media as well. So I really want us to think about how seriously the government takes this. While we can talk about state capture, right, or state ownership of media, what's important also is the way in which governments have control over private media as well, right? So Çevrimiçi is shown on Show TV, right? And that is not owned by the government. That is owned by a holding group. And that holding group's ownership and its media arm have changed over time. It used to be Ciner, but you can see the ways in which holding groups purchase television stations or newspapers, and they use those as kind of channels to show pro-government content or content that the government approves with in order to get political favors for, say, their construction companies or their mining companies, right? And so this is kind of an exchange of political favors for pro-government media content. So when we think about the media landscape in Turkey, about 90 to 95% of it is influenced by the AKP because of these private ownership infrastructures, right? And then we can also think about legislation that tilts the battlefield, the ways in which even digital platforms are being regulated, the data localization laws, the social media laws, the fact that each platform like Netflix has to have a local representative in Turkey that is sort of accountable to the ruling party. That again constricts the space in which potential opportunities for creative resistance can take place, and it expands the space in which the government can sort of control the type of content that is being shared. So I just wanted to give us a real powerful sense of how challenging this particular battleground can be to play on. And then of course film licensing and funding, right? So if you want to shoot a film, if you want to shoot a documentary, if you want your film to be shown in theaters, you have to get a permit from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, for example. What we saw with Kalkınmaya was that there was funding given to this particular film and that it was approved, but then once the government realized that there was queer content in the film, that funding was revoked, right? They asked for that funding back. And so this is just another way in which the government, again, is not sort of policing only news media, but entertainment media as well, and sort of the norms of the ideal Turkish citizen that they want to see, right? And then you have all these other laws on disinformation and insults and so forth. But in addition to kind of ownership and laws, some of the informal tools we can think about that also tilt the battleground are things like blacklisting. So if actors post something on social media that the government does not approve of, that means that they might not get hired for their next project. You can think of sort of banal bans, right, where they're not canceling the concert because they don't like the political content. They cancel a concert because they didn't have the right permit, or there might be a security issue, or the government needs that spot at the last minute. There's lots and lots of cancellations of Kurdish language concerts in particular that you can probably think of, that they're not saying that this is a political choice, but often they're sort of giving excuses for why these concerts are canceled. And then there's also the role of leader rhetoric and the way in which powerful political individuals can call for action against a television show, and that action can actually take place. So again, giving us a sense of sort of what we might be up against, or what individuals who want to engage in creative resistance might be up against. And speaking of leader rhetoric, this is the first piece that I ever published on Turkey. This was in Foreign Policy, and it was about Erdogan, Prime Minister Erdogan's language at the time against Muhteşem Yüzyıl, the Magnificent Century, and how he did not think this was representative of Turkish history, how this was an insult to national values, and he thought that there should be some kind of action taken against it. And in fact, while we saw a fine on the show, what we also saw several weeks later, and this is something that I think is really important when you're looking at television production, is the speed at which these television shows, these dizis, are being made, because they can react to government pressure. They can include scenes that have a political response, right? And what we saw with Muhteşem Yüzyıl was, in fact, Hürrem, the character who had perhaps been the most the décolletage and perhaps the most seductive, she actually covers her hair in praise. And so the public sort of was pushing back at that and saying, oh, wow, what's happening to these television shows? They're sort of caving to government pressure. And in fact, this kicks off, arguably, a slew of television shows that are in the eyes of what the AKP wants to see when it comes to national history, right? So Direniş is one of the shows that becomes kind of the focal point of the AKP's attempt to use entertainment media both at home as kind of a tool of imparting norms of appropriate behavior for citizens, but also, of course, this campaign abroad whereby you're cultivating soft power in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, in lots and lots of places where these shows are being dubbed and watched avidly. So Direniş was kind of the show that kicks this all off. And it's widely known that this is produced for Turkish state television, so it's a Turkish government project, and that Erdogan and his family have, visited the set, and that they are fans of this particular show. So they've given their endorsement to this type of entertainment. And then you sort of saw a flood of lots and lots of similar shows that are coming through the TRT stations that I mentioned, that are similarly focused on battle, on piety, on chasteness, on morality, on strong masculine characters, just a lot of the same content that we see throughout these shows. So again, just thinking about how much the government invests in this particular medium. And then we've got the criminalization of and in the culture sphere. And I want us to take this really seriously. We, of course, have Ayşe Barım, who was the talent agent who had been arrested, house arrest, then released, then arrested again. Obviously going through very serious health issues as well, but she became a target of the government, supposedly because the government said she had encouraged her actors to participate in the Gezi protests. So this is a recent court case that goes all the way back to Gezi. You also have Osman Kavala, who was arrested both and charged both with participation in the coup attempt and then also with Gezi Park as well. And we're going to talk about why Gezi becomes this sort of focal point. And part of it has to do with artists' participation in it and the very real presence of creative resistance in Gezi. But what you saw on Tabii, which is the digital platform of state entertainment in Turkey, was a television show that very, very closely resembled Osman Kavala's life, painting him as a villain. Right? So taking this individual who has been in jail for many years and sort of dramatizing his life in a way that justifies why he needs to stay in jail. So the use of media in order to justify a particular judicial decision. As I mentioned earlier, we of course had the fine and the broadcast ban on Çevrimiçi, which came from the media watchdog. And then more recently, you had the arrest of one of its prominent actors in line with this larger net that has been cast, a drag net, if you will, to charge actors with drug use, drug operations. So again, just really thinking about why the culture sphere has been targeted as much as it is one of the things we want to think about, because it gives us a sense of the power of the culture industry, of creative resistance, of why the government doesn't want this to sort of operate independently on its own. When we think about culture and sort of cultural groups, we can think about lots of ways in which we see pre-organized groups engage in civil society activism. If we go back to the Gezi protests, which again was happening around the same time that Muhteşem Yüzyıl was being fined, right? That was winter of 2012. You had Gezi in May, June of 2023. I argue this is sort of a time at which the government starts to realize that the culture industry, those who participate in the production of culture and those who repurpose it, are political threats and need to be targeted, right? So Çarşı is a great example of a pre-existing group, right? The fan club of the ultra fan club of Beşiktaş becomes a huge presence in the Gezi Park protests. And I remember doing research both in Kulu Park in Ankara and in Gezi as well. People were excited for Çarşı to show up. They brought knowledge, they brought flares, they brought energy to the protest, and people often went to see if Çarşı was going to show up. And in fact, they also sort of served as a buffer, for those who maybe were inexperienced in protest or inexperienced in getting roughed up by the police, getting beaten by the police. Çarşı was sort of a barrier for some of them. You also saw the LGBT bloc come together in Gezi. Now, these are some pre-existing organizations that rallied together during Gezi, using their history as social networks to support the movement. And in fact, there are these really meaningful moments between members of Çarşı and the LGBT bloc where Çarşı members apologized for the homophobic slurs that they had used, recognizing that those who were part of the LGBT bloc, that they were hurting them in doing that, and that these people were just as, tough as they were. They were also standing up for the right to free speech and organizing to do so. And then you have also probably seen scenes of the anti-capitalist Muslims, right, that organized the iftar dinners. So you have these pre-existing groups that we know that were part of Gezi. But then you saw, like I said, this push from the culture industry, this representation of artists. And prominent among them was Halit Ergenç, right? The guy who plays the lead character in Muhteşem Yüzyıl, right? So you have Sultan Süleyman with his beard that you would recognize from his character, and he's very prominent. He's of course there with Bergüzar Kural, Rıza Kocaoğlu, lots of other stars as well, but he kind of becomes the most prominent figure. And that, I think, is not a coincidence of why there is this targeting of the culture industry. In fact, he becomes the individual who speaks for artists' attempts to negotiate with the government, right? So let's think about what's happening when we have artists involved in this, right? They have a platform, they have visibility, they have power. They can speak on behalf of individuals. This was after a meeting with artists and the government. And they announced that they're sort of going to let the judicial process go through with the Gezi protests. Some people thought they didn't push enough, but it seemed as though the park was going to be able to continue, and the plan to destroy it was over. But really thinking about why these individuals become such focal points, I think, is important. And of course, they also become targets as well. Halit Ergenç and many of those who participated and were very prominent faces were targeted by the government in many ways following this. And in some cases had to switch to doing more Netflix television shows, were sort of targeted in the press. Some had to, Mehmet Ali Alabora had to move abroad. So there was really a pushback from the government in terms of this participation. But we also saw other groups, right? In addition to these individual actors, we saw Duman, of course, with the song Eyvallah, which sort of becomes a protest theme. I can't tell you how many times I heard that song while in Kulu Park and in Gezi. So it became something that people rallied around. I think we want to think of the power of music, the emotions, the collective experience of singing together, of feeling a sense of resilience and resistance despite the tear gas, despite the water cannons. This was something that gave individuals a sense of community, a sense of purpose, a reason to be there. And in fact, and this is what I think hopefully relates most to what we're talking about here, is that individuals who didn't really think of themselves as political, who really hadn't, engaged in any sort of even civic initiatives, became politicized or became active civic participants through their experience at Gezi. And part of that was because they were all sort of being, targeted by tear gas and by water cannons, but they felt a sense of solidarity in the people next to them. People were helping them, people who were, giving them cures for tear gas, people that were putting out water for dogs, all of these kinds of things. And you're all familiar with this, right? The sense of solidarity that Gezi was cultivating. And the thing is that can in part be replicated, and culture can be a part of that. The way in which individuals can rally around a protest song or can rally around sort of a funny meme that people share is perhaps not as powerful as being in person at a protest, linking arms with individuals, but it can create that same sense of resilience and resistance that I think we shouldn't discount as people who are interested in what sort of fosters civic participation. And another example was a mashup video. You saw lots and lots of these mashup videos. Obviously, çapulcu was the term that the government had used to try to vilify the protesters. They sort of took it on themselves and inverted the meaning and said, I'm also a çapulcu, and caused that to take on a new significance. And this was a mashup video that was to the theme of LMFAO's party rock anthem, or Every Day I'm Shuffling, but they translated it, or they kind of repurposed it to Every Day I'm Çapuling. And it's a fantastic mashup video that I can share the link in the chat later if you haven't seen it, in terms of individuals, again, coming together, dancing halai, standing in front of water cannons, kind of, trying to defend the right to peaceful protest in a sense. So those are some examples of popular individuals using their cultural capital at Gezi. But if you're not an artist, there are also ways in which individuals can repurpose the cultural capital that artists have created in expressing themselves politically and in networking and mobilizing as part of civic resistance. So this was a phrase that I took a picture of. This is not my photo. Mine didn't come out as well, but this is, I think, one that people saw quite a lot. Tayyip Winter is coming, right? So you have a Game of Thrones reference that a lot of people are sort of seeing as representative of the political moment, right? Like your winter is coming, your end is near, you're not going to be able to reign for forever. So the fact that a Game of Thrones reference becomes a very commonly used slogan during this, I think, is really important. And we can think about the way in which pop culture can promote virality. That is, people tend to pay attention to, their attention is grabbed by this. They tend to share it more. And that sharing can increase the visibility of these acts of civic resistance as well. Another one was the play on biber gazı and Justin Bieber, right? So we saw people who were saying, well, I'm just in Bieber. I'm referencing of course, the singer Justin Bieber, but I'm just hanging out. We're just covered by tear gas, and yet we're continuing to engage in this resistance. So again, those plays on words, those little uses of humor, those little bits of clever wit became sort of a rallying tactic in the face of this very asymmetrical power dynamic with the government, right? The protesters, of course, don't have tear gas. They don't have water cannons. What they have is their wit and their humor and their ability to push back at what they were experiencing. Another example was Sermiyan Midyat, a comedian who on live television on CNN Turk, which of course was the television show that had shown a penguin documentary, while CNN International was showing footage of the Gezi protests and the police violence that was happening there. So if you watch this clip, he starts with a button-down shirt and he kind of slowly unbuttons it while he's live on CNN Turk. And he's, above the Gezi of Taksim Meydanı, essentially. And so you can hear the cheer that goes up when he reveals that he's wearing a penguin t-shirt, essentially using his position, his cultural capital as a famous comedian to get an interview on television and then transform that subversively to show support for the protesters, right? On the television station that everyone is making fun of for having shown a penguin documentary. Another use of live television was kelime oyunu, or word game, where again on a live taping, every single clue had to do with Gezi Park protests, and you can sort of see the contestant get kind of confused about, should I be saying these things? Should I be referencing things like gas mask and police and all of this? But this was a use of live television, that cultural capital, that platform that gets tremendous amount of attention, that people are tweeting about, that people are feeling as though I'm not alone. There's others who are in this with me. And that's a really important part of creative resistance as well, is showing solidarity and kind of building up networks even through humor. Now, of course, that show was taken off of live airing, right, as a punishment for that. But it got its point across. It used the live taping for that purpose. So wrapping up, just a couple of other examples that I wanted to give in terms of how pop culture can be used in resistance. And it's not that you need to be a musician, right? It's not that you need to be Metallica. You can use those references, or individuals who are interested in creating networks of resistance, they can sort of use these references in clever and creative ways that then go viral and then bring more attention to one's cause, right? So, of course, if you're familiar with the Boğaziçi University rector example, Melih Bolu goes on television and says, well, I don't know why they don't like me. I'm a Metallica fan, right? And then, of course, people come back and they say, no, he's not really a Metallica fan. He's a rector of puppets, right? So kind of using the Master of Puppets Metallica song and showing that, in fact, this individual is the puppet, right? He's the one who has been placed in this position of leadership by the government, this Kayyum rector, essentially. So that clever use of the lyrics was something that got tremendous amount of attention. Again, lots of sharing. Boğaziçi students also showed up and, in kind of the center square, blasted Master of Puppets, blasted Sad But True, all of these songs that have sort of meanings that are critical, that can be interpreted as critical of the government. And so that, immediately got students out into the square, and they were dancing and they were kind of resisting as well. On the 100th day of the protests, the vigil in Boğaziçi against the imposed rector, you had a faculty band that got together and played some cover songs. And one of them was The Man Who Sold the World, which I think was a pretty powerful indictment sort of the neoliberalism and sort of the destruction of parks, the destruction of green spaces, the potential attempt to even buy or acquire parts of Boğaziçi's campus. So again, kind of using language or using themes that are in these pieces of cultural content for their political purpose. And then, and maybe not everyone is familiar with this, but there's a group called Marla, who had at least one Boğaziçi student in this, who put together a song called Aşağıya Bakma, after protesters were told to look down while the police were corralling them, right? So there were student protesters and police were kind of corralling them up, and a police individual sort of yelled, "You should be looking down." And then this song is put together, don't look down, continue to resist. Again, these similar themes of resilience and resistance being put together through pop culture. In terms of the many different ways in which digital media, this platform that a lot of these pieces of cultural content can be shared, we want to have a good understanding of how that works, right? And sharing information via social media is great for coordination, right? Where are we going to meet? What time? What should we bring? Having a sense that we can disseminate our plans through social media. Of course, governments can also use this as an opportunity for surveillance. There's always that side. You can use hashtags as a way to sort of narrate your story, to get solidarity building, to build visibility. Mentions on social media can help pool resources. So if you're, mentioning a famous artist, or you're mentioning, a company that might have resources that you might be able to use, that can help gather medical supplies. That can help gather water bottles. That can be a way to coordinate and pool resources as well. What I really want us to get us to think about, though, and Gökçe and I were talking about this earlier, is the way in which social media and images and audiovisual media and videos can serve as attention grabbers, right? In this media landscape, we're just constantly scrolling through videos. And so this is often a way that we need to think about how can we get people's attention. But images can also document, right? They can document police violence. They can document how many people are in the square. They can make people more willing to participate because they know they're not going to be alone, right? And we can talk about deep fakes and AI and all the trouble that can bring with it. But we really want to think about the role of images in documenting and in evoking emotions, right? The anger or the grief or the frustration or the joy or the humor that can come from a single image or a video clip, I think is really important. And the fact that pop culture can sort of amplify the interest in these particular posts. One of the things to keep in mind is that when something becomes quite popular on social media, when it becomes viral, then you have news stations starting to cover it as well. Right? So when you start to have the penguin being tweeted over and over as a symbol of Gezi resistance, then it sort of forces the news stations to have to cover it themselves. And again, with things like pop culture, things that are immediately recognizable, that are being imbued with political content, that might be funny, or that might have some kind of indictment of power structure, that can drive virality as well. People are going to be more likely to share those, more likely to pay attention to those because of the emotions that they evoke, because of the resonance, right? So when you see, Pikachu showing up at a protest, this is something that is going to be shared more frequently. And in fact, there were a lot of AI takes on this as well. So Pikachu, did show up at a protest, but in Saraçhane, but then ended up also being sort of created into a lot of images as well. But thinking about the role that these particular symbols can play, because they're familiar, they're subversive, and they can grab people's attention. And then these symbols of protest, like the penguin, can take on pop culture status themselves, such that a comedian is going to wear a t-shirt that has a penguin on it. Or, as in the protests in the United States against ICE, you have the frog, who sort of became the symbol of protests. You have this, inflatable creature who looks a little bit ridiculous, whose image amplifies the lack of appropriateness of violence against someone who might be just standing there wearing a frog costume, right? So there's something that's almost absurd about a police officer beating someone in a frog costume that might not be the same if the person was just regularly dressed. But these then become focal points, and they become shared, and you have more frogs showing up and more people in penguin costumes, and that adds to almost the sense of solidarity there, right? And then very last, I just wanted to show an example from the television show that I started with, the Nursema example. And of course, here we have this image that I showed earlier with a very powerful statement of resilience, right? We're not going to vomit blood, and we're not going to say that we drank cranberry sorbet. So neither are we going to allow you to hurt us, nor are we going to lie about the hurt that we have experienced, kind of turning that kan kusam kızılcık şerbeti içtim derim phrase around, right? Pushing back against it with this very defiant character who had become this feminist icon. Now, how does this all fit into politics, right? So there was this pretext, this sort of engagement of another very popular pop culture reference when Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu goes to the party group and says in parliament and says, the day after the elections, the bad guys are going to get the phone call, and the phones are going to be ringing off the hook, and I'm going to say, it's me, Kemal, I'm coming, right? And of course, he's referencing the Cüneyt Arkın film, where Cüneyt Arkın kind of goes and rounds up the bad guys and, calls from a telephone booth and says, it's me, Kemal, I'm coming. And everybody laughs and everybody gets the joke, and it becomes something that people kind of rally around. And then this becomes something that gets taken up by the television show as well, pushing back against the ban against the show, pushing back against the sense that if the government or if the AKP wins, then that doesn't seem to bode well for women, for their futures, for their independence, especially given a lot of the moves that the AKP had made, withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention and so forth. So here again is, individuals who are not artists themselves necessarily, but are tweeting, are sharing, are infusing content with political meaning, but making it viral, making it humorous, and making it subversive because it is this very popular culture reference. So I just want us to think about really the power of popular culture in creating humor, in being subversive, in creating networks of solidarity, and in getting people interested in politics. So I'll stop there and I will take any questions that you have. But before I do, I thought I'd just put a couple of the articles that I've worked on in terms of popular culture up there, and I can also share the links later. So thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Lisa. That was great. And you went us through all the history, like the recent history that we've been witnessing, people living in Turkey. And then it's so good that, you watch everything really closely, and then from your, expertise way of looking things. I want to start with a question, and then I'll try to get other questions from participants if there are any. But I wanted to ask, you talk about creative resistance and, the potential strategies, but I wanted to ask, where do we see its effects? Because from our point of view, from different viewpoints, let's say, currently, isn't independent civil society in Turkey facing even greater crackdowns, and Gezi and Boğaziçi can seem also kind of unsuccessful civic activism from certain point. What is your point on those?
Yeah, this is a really, really important question. And I think it's a question that it makes a lot of sense when, if we think of Gezi as not just let's protect the park, but that the grievances turned into something bigger, right? They turned into, we don't want to see police violence used against peaceful protesters. We don't want to see media censorship. And yet we continue to see those. So some might say that Gezi wasn't very effective. And certainly with the Boğaziçi resistance as well. You have these daily vigils, these, extreme case of resilience where you have individuals standing rain or shine, snow, what have you, in resistance against the imposition of a rector. But what I want us to think about is not just like the government falling or the rector leaving as a political outcome. I think that there are ways in which the Gezi spirit sort of still lives on. I think that people may become disillusioned if they don't see a major political change, but major political changes in a regime that has as much consolidation of power within the executive as Turkey does, as much crackdown on civil society as a case like Turkey does. it's rare, and it means a lot of things have to come together. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand about everyday resistance is that it allows people to sort of continue existing in a regime or in a government in which they're sort of being told that they can't speak freely, or that they may not have the freedoms that they want. So there's an element of resilience there that I think is really important. But there's also the networks that get built and the skills that get learned and the willingness to think about politics, the willingness to become engaged in politics that happens through these, sometimes fun, sometimes clever, sometimes creative, but oftentimes in the face of violence. If you think about like the number of people that stayed at Gezi, despite the people who died, despite the people who lost eyes, despite the many injuries that they faced, there was a sense of collective identity and solidarity and belonging that I see culture as reinforcing and as amplifying. So one way to think about it is often a government will become more plural, or a government that's been in power for a long time will fall when there is some kind of political opening. And that could be a split between elites, as we saw in the Hungary case, right? So the individual who won in Hungary had previously been a part of the Fidesz party. There's a lot of differences in the Turkey-Hungary case that I'm happy to talk about, but you can see maybe the security forces are no longer willing to, use violence against protesters. There's some kind of opening. That's when all of that groundswell of support that has been built through that solidarity, through that resistance, through that networking, that's when that comes to the fore. And those skills that have been built and the relationships that have been formed become really important. And every once in a while, you'll see a rallying of that, right? So again, in 2023, there was almost a sense that this was a time in which perhaps political change could happen. There was optimism that people hadn't seen in a long time. There was a Tarkan song that came out during the pandemic called Geçecek. And it wasn't clear if it was like, is it the pandemic that's going to pass, or is it the government that's going to pass, right? And people, even if it didn't bring about significant political change, people rallied for a little while, and they saw it as something that was heartening and something to sort of get excited about. And so I think we want to take the argument that, popular culture really just kind of dulls us, and it gives us something to talk about. I understand that argument. But there's also a sense that people become engaged in politics through this sort of deployment of popular culture content that I think is really important. So it is the case, I think we need to take seriously the argument that, well, actually, politics hasn't changed, but at what level, right? And maybe politics hasn't changed at the top level in terms of who's in power, but you may have more people who are engaged, who are participating, and who feel connected to each other because of the resistance.
And maybe, like you said, we shouldn't underestimate the small acts like a tweet, a meme, a reference, or even a conversation can also contribute to shaping those narratives and then making issues like, keeping them visible in time, probably.
Exactly. And particularly this sort of role of political science, we call it preference revelation. Like often in places where free speech is curtailed, people don't know if they can speak up, right? And they're afraid of what happens if they post something that's critical. But when you start to see other people doing it, there's sort of a tipping point and almost a snowballing effect that can happen, whereby you don't feel as alone and you feel emboldened or more likely to participate because you know that you're not alone. So in that sense, even just a tweet can make a difference.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have so many questions, but I wanted to ask the participants if there are any. The floor is yours, and then please don't be shy, ask questions. Otherwise, I will be asking. I mean, there can be questions and also some thoughts and ideas too. Okay, I see Ibrahim, Musab, Jurabaz. So raise hand function helps. Please stick with that. Ibrahim, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry for I couldn't open my video, but I just want to add the contribution, this pop culture and this resistance dialogue about the marginalization of this, because of those social movements I witnessed in the Boğaziçi University really has a danger of the marginalization from the society, and because the media and the power tools easily transform with the violence and showing the violence pictures and the videos to people and making them they are just marginal people, and especially this marginalization threat overcome by, I guess, this pop culture, using the pop culture and humor, which connect the people, even they are not directly affected by the conflict all over the country, all over the world. This, especially the popular culture, really help the anti-marginalization of this movement. I guess I just want to make a contribution. Maybe you have something to say about the marginalization and overcome this problem. Yeah.
I really appreciate you using that term and bringing this up, because you're absolutely right that, and this is not just in the case in Turkey. What governments in power often try to do when they're challenged, and they don't want to give space or legitimacy to protesters or legitimacy to civil society organizations, is they marginalize them, right? And so they say, oh, it's just birkaç çapulcu, right? It's just a couple of hooligans. Or they try to associate them with violence, right? They call them terrorists, they call them thugs, they call them all these different very locally charged terms, right? So like, particularly during the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, President Trump called the people who were protesting thugs. And he used that word very specifically because it has a racialized terminology, saying that he was equating everyone who was participating with being sort of the image of the violent Black man that the media has constructed. So it was a very racist way of trying to marginalize protesters. Similarly, with the way in which the AKP in Turkey has used terrorist associations or terrorist labels, and sometimes criminalizing, right? This is a way of criminalizing protest, is to say that these individuals are part of a terrorist group. And what that does is it makes people fear coming out and supporting a protest because they don't want to be associated with any kind of violence or criminality, right? It kind of makes it look like the protest is smaller than it is. And also, there's often a marginalization that happens when they say, oh, these are foreign funded, right? This is George Soros. This is, no one in Turkey would organically, indigenously be angry at the government. This is just a nebulous foreign conspirator. That happens in almost every case of protest you can find, from the Arab uprisings to the color revolutions in the former Soviet republics. And we, of course, saw that during Gezi as well. The interest rate lobby, right? The Soros lobby and things like that. These are foreign actors. But what pop culture does is it brings more people together. It sort of satirizes the government's attempt to marginalize protesters. And it gets it out on a really wide platform, such that people can see, oh, it almost debunks or undoes the government's attempt to try to marginalize these individuals. So if there is an artist that is very well respected by a lot of people and they stand up for the protesters, that does something, right? And then the protesters themselves, even if they're not famous artists and don't have a platform, they can then create some of these memes and mashups and other things that we talked about. So I really appreciate the point about marginalization, because popular culture can be a way to kind of show, no, we're not foreign funded. There's a lot of us, and we're going to keep going no matter what your attempts to try to silence us are.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great contribution. Thank you.
Yeşim?
Oh, hello. Hello, Lisa.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for all this information you gave me. It was very, very surprising and very, very good. And I'm glad that it is recorded so I can watch it again.
Yeah, it was a lot.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you because of the new law of the Turkish government for controlling the access to the internet. Especially, they said it was just to protect the young people under 15 from using social media and other platforms. But critics say that it was just an instrument to control us, all the young people or the old people, all people who show their opinion and who find also groups to take part in activism, for example, via social media. And now we have to give in all our personal information to the government, and then they can just look at Instagram, and then they see, okay, who am I following and what comments do I make, and which groups are following me or people are following me. And now I think this is a very, very serious situation now, worse than it was in Gezi time.
So I really appreciate your question, and I agree. Your take that, and it goes back to Gökçe's question about, well, has change actually happened if the government has just, cracked down more on our ability to have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of participation. Certainly, the level of surveillance on social media, I think, is really important. And in fact, if you look at some of the pop culture content, right? During Gezi, it was resilience and fun and humorous, and there was a carnival-esque atmosphere. And if you look at the convergence of a couple of rap videos in September of 2019, for example, that was when Susamam and Olay came out. So two rap videos, one a big compilation or collective collaboration of a whole bunch of artists, and another a very critical rap video. Though you don't have that fun atmosphere anymore, right? It's much more about violence against women. It's much more about Syria. It's much more about times have gotten scarier in a sense. So I think you're right. The point you raise about social media laws is really important. And what we know is that governments have historically used reasoning like protecting the family, protecting youth, protecting the nation in order to control the type of content that we see on television, on the air, on social media. So Kurak Günler was an example of that. They don't want to see queer content. The fines that were levied against Disney Plus and Netflix is another example of that. You saw a Netflix show that was in the works going to be filmed in Turkey, and then the government said you need to take the queer character out of that, and Netflix said no thank you, we'll go film somewhere else. So it is the case that governments are increasing, and certainly in Turkey, coming up with, as I said earlier, kind of a definition of who the ideal Turkish citizen is, how they behave, how they dress, how they speak. It has very gendered prescriptions, as well as my article on cooking shows, right? All women should have at least 3 children. This is the way that you can get in good with your mother-in-law. You can use her recipes, and that way your husband will be happy, right? Like there's all of these narratives that fit the very biopolitical project of the AKP, right, of the woman in New Turkey. So it is the case that these laws can be used in those ways, right? So you can say, I'm going to ban social media for everybody under 15 because I fear that is a hindrance to their development. And Gökçe and I were talking on this morning, like I came here this morning to my office on the metro, and every single child that was there going to school had their head over the phone. So in a sense, I'm not there can be very good reasons for those types of measures. We saw them in Australia. We've seen them in lots of other cases. But the problem is that they can be shaped in ways that fit government agendas, right? So if we want to kind of to restrict youth access, then maybe we keep them off social media. So the problem is it can serve two ends, right? And what we always want to kind of be looking for is why the government is engaging in this kind of policy, and what the benefits and the challenges are, right? And as you say, this is one of many measures that has happened, right? The data localization laws that I mentioned earlier, having to have a representative from each platform in Turkey makes takedown requests much easier, right? So there's just a lot more of the ability of the government to control social media. So while there can be legitimate health and societal reasons for those kinds of bans, it's also a very easy way for the government to use that for its own political purposes as well. So it's definitely a challenge in that sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, Jan has a question on the chat. I'll try to bring that. So would you say then that the government's support of popular culture is a way to push back at civic engagement?
So it absolutely is. And in fact, I'm trying to make the argument in the book that I'm finishing on popular culture as this tilted battleground where the government controls a lot of the tools and the opposition or individuals in civil society have small places where they can kind of show their resistance. I think a lot of it has to do with the timing of the Gezi protests and of the Muhteşem Yüzyıl controversy. I think it was a turning point in which the government recognized that the AKP was trying to use sort of Ottoman-themed legitimacy in terms of its foreign actions, right? So at the time, there was a lot of kind of the soft power outreach of the government in the Arab world, in the Balkans, Western Balkans, and sort of the former Ottoman territories. And what the government saw was that this Ottoman content wasn't matching its Ottoman content. And it saw that it needed to control that. It didn't like to see all these scenes of women in the harem with cleavage. It didn't like to see individuals drinking alcohol or the suggestion that they might be drinking alcohol. And so it targets that particular show. And it ends up, it was banned from Turkish Airlines in-flight, content. So it wasn't just Erdogan saying something about it. This had political consequences. And then, as I said, the creators of the show changed the content. But it kind of catalyzed this focus on the culture industry. And I think Halit Ergenç's participation in Gezi, I think all of that let the government know that, wow, there's a lot more opposition than we thought, and the culture industry is playing a really powerful role in that. What I don't want the lesson to be is, oh, Halit Ergenç should never have gone to Gezi, and artists should shut up, and we should. That's not the role to play, right? I don't think that's the lesson to learn. I think it's that we want to understand how and why the government is trying to flood popular culture with its own content. And the Ayşe Badem arrest in part could be seen as, again, the claim was that she had encouraged her actors to go to Gezi, and people testified that no, that wasn't the case. But it's also about her share of the pie, right? How much money and power she controlled by having so many very famous actors on her roster, on her list as a talent agent. And so that can be seen as a way to try to kind of spread to take away the capital and put it in the government's hands, right? Almost like capture of that talent. The blacklists that I mentioned are another way of doing that. The ways in which even the government operations right now against actors and artists, were some of them caught testing positive for drugs? Perhaps, yeah. Is this a way to also, kind of like with the social media regulation, was there something bad? Maybe, but is the government using it in its hands? Maybe, right? And so we want to think about why the government is paying so much attention to popular culture. So I do think it is an attempt to try to sort of erase civic resistance. But my argument is that's never going to happen. And it's because there is always going to be the intersection of humor and art and subversion, and the ability of art to speak to power, right? To speak truth to power. and to rally emotions and to represent people's grievances in ways that they can visualize in a music video, or that they can feel the power of the emotion of a song, or they see it in a clip on television. And that I don't think can ever be erased. And that I think is why, even in the Soviet Union, we saw, if you go all the way back to the way that the Soviet Union collapsed, I don't want to say guarantee. There was an Estonian song festival that took place in 1988. And for the first time, people, because, the vernacular languages were banned, and these artists decided to sing in Estonian. And all of a sudden people started, singing in Estonian, and this was a very subversive act, and it started spreading. And then you had individuals lined up across Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, the Baltic Way. They lined up on the streets. It was a catalyst. It was, this is possible. Oh, wow. And then other people start engaging in similar acts. So I really want us to never lose the sense that as much as the government tries to co-opt and bring into its own hands, and to be fair, like if you're an artist, and this is the same with journalists, right? I've spoken to so many journalists who they need a livelihood, they need pay, they need to work. And so, maybe they work for a newspaper that is now owned in government hands, and maybe they try to do little subversive acts here and there, but so there's ways in which the government, I think, is trying to co-opt the entertainment industry in the same way that it brought Hürriyet Gazetesi and these others, right, into Demirören holding company. But they can never do that fully, because there's always going to be creative people who are using humor, who are using emotion, who are pushing back. And Erdogan and others have said repeatedly, like, we haven't won the culture war, right? We've got political hegemony, we don't have cultural hegemony. And it's a thorn in his side. He doesn't like that. Look at the attacks on political satire magazines, right? The closure of all of these. The controversy last year, last 2 summers ago, Prophet Muhammad, doesn't matter. So the attack on Liman, the attack on or the targeting of these sites, because they don't want to see that creativity continue to have a subversive purpose, and it still does. I don't think there has been any regime that has been able to completely wipe that out.
But then this means there is dangers and downside of this creative resistance, using the creative resistance, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the challenge, right? That's the risk. And if there are lots of people doing it, then there's safety in numbers and you're not alone. If there's a few people doing it, it becomes very, very risky. As I said, there are some artists who've had to leave Turkey. There are others who are constantly smeared in the newspapers or are blacklisted. So it is absolutely a risk. And it's up to individuals to decide how they navigate that. But it does make one a risk.
Yeah, there are more questions actually. Musa is on the way and he's saying that, thank you, Lisel. This is Musa, also from the Zoom writing sessions, which actually I will be asking you about your writing sessions.
Yes.
Maybe you can give another information before we close up. But he's saying that also from the Zoom writing sessions you have been organizing. My question is, how do you assess the proposed legal regulations in Turkey that will require users to access social media through identity verification e-government system, which is circulating right now? Do you view this primarily as a measure for regulation and accountability, or as a potential restriction on freedom of expression and an attempt to control the narrative?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, very well put, and it goes back to the theme that Yeşim raised earlier, in the sense that, Turkey is not the only government that is engaging in this kind of ability to collect more information, ability to surveil. It just is kind of indicative of the power of these big tech platforms and the ways in which they have ties to government, or I should say the ways in which the government can leverage them for their own purposes. And so that gets, I think, to exactly the point of the question. I can't know the inner workings of these individuals' minds, but I can see a broader trend in the way that if you go from 2020, 2021, 22, like each year there was a new law having to do with data regulation or social media use. There was a disinformation law. And so there's this successive passing of laws that constrict and constrict and constrict the space, but that also are not just constricting the space, but upping the ability to surveil. And that was what Yeshim had referred to earlier, right? The ability to know what your networks are. And this is why governments don't just shut down the internet, right? This is like, it's useful information for them. They can also engage in disinformation themselves. They can use trolls. They can use, which we know that has been the case in Turkey, as someone who's been the subject of quite a lot of them. So there's lots and lots of different ways that governments can almost turn what people thought was going to be the democratization of the internet, right? The ability of people to organize freely, spread information, counter misinformation, all of that. Again, it's asymmetric. It seems like governments have and are increasingly adding to their power, their ability to, again, not just limit information, but also disseminate narratives that are in their favor, and then also surveil. And I think that's really what both you and Yashim are getting at. So I never see these policies as strictly one or the other, because I look at the broader context and I look at the many ways in which the government is trying to restrict the opposition's ability to organize, to mobilize freely. You look at the numbers of protests that are shut down. You look at the people who are detained for posting something critical or insulting the government or insulting the nation. That's another law that, of course, has been used quite frequently. So I never see it as purely about this is, collecting more information. I see it in a broader context of being able to have more information means being able to have more control. And that's the really worrying trend.
Yeah. Okay, and then Jen has another follow-up question. Do you see examples of AKP influence abroad or pop culture resistance from abroad that impacts the domestic context?
So that's a great question. As I said earlier, there was a real push to use disease as a foreign policy tool, and lots of people, much more published than I am, have worked on this quite a bit. If you look at like cafes in Pakistan named after Direnish, like it's a huge industry. Turkey is the #3 exporter of television shows in the world after the United States and the UK. And initially it was sort of about the Arab world and the Western Balkans. Then it became Asia, it became Latin America, almost supplanting the telenovela. So it's been a huge push. And if you think about it, it's an incredibly lucrative industry. The content of Turkish television shows is extremely high, and it's because the domestic market is so competitive. They have to be really good. Otherwise, by week 7, you look at the ratings, and if you don't have a good score, you're off. So it's extremely competitive. My colleague Ergin Bulut he's finishing a fantastic book on this. Please buy it when it's out. But he's working on kind of the labor industry in the cultural sector, and these people are just worked to the bone. To make these 2.5-hour shows as quickly as they can. Sorry, I'm getting too far into the weeds. But the point is, you have the flooding of the international market with Turkish television shows in order to promote, it's already a lucrative strategy to sell those shows. Then you can also create export markets because people want to buy Turkish goods. Then you have tourism. You have tours that are set up so that you can come and like tour the mansions where Gümüş was filmed. So it's a big industry all on its own. Ergin Bulut is his name, and yes, I can put that in the chat. He is an unbelievable scholar of media, and the book I'm mentioning is not out yet, but he has a article particularly on Netflix platforms, and how people thought this was going to be a much freer space. But now we see, as we were talking about earlier with the questions of social media and digital platforms, the government also increasing its control over digital platforms as well. But the labor conditions are better on Netflix than they are in the Turkish sector. So do we see examples of AKP influence or pop culture resistance from abroad that impacts the domestic context? I would say that the great majority of the Turkish content that is consumed abroad is more by those who are aligned with the government, and not necessarily those that are resisting it. So again, it's because it's used as a soft power tool. It's meant to very much portray the government in a popular light. And even with like diaspora communities in Germany or the Netherlands, for example, they often tend to be sort of, it's interesting, you know, they vote for the AKP in Turkish elections, and then they vote for the Green Party in Germany. It's a very interesting kind of political disparity. But in terms of what's happening abroad, I would say the ability of the domestic opposition to create transnational linkages is a really important one. But there is a hazard with support from abroad, and that is that it can be turned or framed by the government into what I was talking about earlier, into vilifying civil society groups within the country because they have foreign contacts, because they have foreign funding or foreign aid, or they're supported from abroad. That almost gives fuel to the fire of a leader who's trying to say, you know, these are all foreign sponsored. These aren't indigenous domestic protests. So there's a tricky link between the international and the domestic, and certainly not just in the case of Turkey, but in other cases as well. With the Georgian opposition, you know, they're often, it's a very popular delegitimation or marginalization strategy, to go back to Ibrahim's question earlier, of being able to say, no, these have foreign connections, so we shouldn't take them seriously. So yeah, so the domestic international linkage gets a little tricky there.
Thank you. Well, actually, we've run a little over our closing time, but before we close, just so you know, like everyone, that this recording will be on YouTube, hopefully within next 2 weeks. And also, I will create a Substack content in Turkish and in English, of course, coordinating with you, Lizelle. And we now have a tradition to add the recommended readings into that content as well. So I'll ask for you if you can share some content with us. I'll be adding them into the Substack. But just before we close, would you mind briefly introducing your writing group? I'm really curious about that. And then maybe using your recommendations for younger generations, younger people, as today's closing remarks.
Okay, sure. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss this group a little bit. And Musa, I'm so glad that you were able to join. It's good to see familiar names here. So I've been running a writing solidarity group for, let's see, we're in our 157th week. So I started it shortly after the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. And I started it because I have benefited so much from my interactions with people in Turkey. I feel like I've gained so much, and I wanted to try to support and provide solidarity where I could. And I saw a lot of academics on social media, you know, about a month after the earthquake, saying, I can't get back to work. I feel really alone. I feel really isolated. I feel really frustrated. And a lot of them were in the diaspora. A lot of them were working, you know, in Europe or in the UK or the US or Canada. And I thought, well, what can I do to kind of make us a community where people can talk about their frustrations and meet new people and get some energy and try and get little work tasks done. And I was particularly worried about PhD students who, you know, you have a limited time frame and limited funding, and if you don't finish and you don't publish, then it's really detrimental. And you know, the job market is not very forgiving, and so I wanted to not let anyone fall between the gaps or fall through the cracks. So I one night I just tweeted, you know, if anyone is interested, let me know. And I thought I'd get like 5 responses, and I heard from like 200 people. So I now have a list of about 350 people. Not everyone has joined. You know, each week I also send out a list of professional development opportunities, research funding, postdocs, things like that. So even if you're just on the list, you get a list of opportunities each week. I also amplify the publications of our group members because I think it's really important to celebrate our successes. We've had 21 PhD students defend their dissertations since we started. So I always celebrate that as well. So, you know, if you want to get on the list, please email me. Let me know. I can, in the Substack, I can provide all the information. But basically the group is for anyone who does writing, who needs to get some writing work done. So you can work at a think tank, you can be a PhD student, you can be a professor. We've got people of all different levels, an MA student, an undergraduate student. If you have students, let me know. It was originally for people from Turkey and Syria, but later that year, sort of given everything going on in the Middle East, and after October 7th, I opened it up for anybody from the Middle East. So we have people from Tunisia and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Lebanon, and so it's a really neat group. And what is it? We meet for 2-hour sessions, and I or my co-hosts start each group off with a very brief chat, like maybe 5-10 minutes, just to hear what everyone's working on, get our morale up. And then we work silently for the remainder of the 2 hours, and you can leave early, you can come late. Think about it like a virtual library. And a place that you can go where you know other people are going to be working, and you can have your camera off or you can have your camera on, and you can get some work done. And that's the goal. So anyone who has questions, please reach out. But it's just a set of writing sessions to help people find community and get motivated and celebrate each other's successes, which I think is maybe the best way. And in answering your question and kind of wrapping up, I think, what governments that want to stay in power for a long time want us to do is to not talk to each other. They want us to be isolated. They want us to not network and not come together and kind of be atomized and demotivated. And what we can do in groups is really powerful. So I think finding those networks and those groups and continuing to talk about our grievances and support each other is the best thing that we can do.
Well, thank you. That was perfect. And the group of yours is also such a great example of community building, and really appreciate it. And thank you very much for joining us today. We learned a lot. Thank you for sharing everything. That was really mind-blowing and mind-opening. We'll keep in touch and we'll give more content to other people. But everyone, thanks a lot for joining us today. And keep in touch with us, stay connected. We will have more webinars and more experts on the queue.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.